The Midlands Today Show with Will Faulkner.
Midlands 103.
Well, still to come, we'll take a look at what job opportunities you can avail of here in the Midlands on the Trade and Recruitment Guide. But first, Neil Armstrong, the first human being to walk on the surface of the moon, has died at the age of 82. He will forever be etched in history for these immortal words.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Seanie Morris joins us from the Midlands Astronomy Club. Seanie, you're very welcome to the programme.
Morning, Will.
Before NASA, who was Neil Armstrong?
Neil Armstrong was actually a fighter pilot in the US Air Force. I believe he had flown a tour at least once during the Korean War. But he also was a test pilot for testing out various planes and that, and was a teacher as well, teaching budding young aviators how to be able to reach for the skies.
So he was a very accomplished airman before even approaching NASA.
That's true, but it does come from the background of NASA's early space program from 1957 onwards when they were selecting astronauts. They all came from an aviation background. It wasn't until Harrison Smith was the last man to actually set foot on the moon in the Apollo 17 mission, was the first civilian during even the Apollo program, whereas everyone else had come from a military background for the preceding decades.
Apollo 11 wasn't Armstrong's first trip into space, though, was it?
No, it wasn't. He actually flew on Gemini 8 back in 1963. He was also a backup for a command pilot on the Gemini 11 mission, but did not fly after that. Subsequently, when the Mercury Gemini program had wrapped up towards the mid-60s, there was a meeting in 1966 where there were 17 astronauts brought into a room with Deke Slayton, who was then one of the NASA administrators in mission control, if you like. And his big immortal words were, among the men who are going to fly on the moon, all of them are in this room. So Armstrong, among them, knew that his time would come. He was either going to be flying and going around the moon or maybe picked, but did not know it at that time, as the guy who was going to actually set foot on the surface.
How hotly contested was that position?
I don't know if it's right to say that it was contested. NASA had its own way of governing how and when missions would fly and who would fly and do what. As the Apollo program gained momentum during the mid-60s, and it was heading towards a likelihood that it was going to be in 1969 that a manned mission was going to successfully land, NASA would determine 3 people per rotation, if you like, with a backup group of another 3. When Apollo 8 was going to be launched in 1967 to send itself up, circle the moon and come back, Aldrin, Armstrong, and not Collins at the time, I forget the astronaut who was actually meant to be in there, were the backup crew to Apollo 8. However, when you were governed a position of backup crew to one of the Apollo missions, that meant that the third mission after that was going to be your actual mission. So he knew, having been made commander of Apollo 8, that he was going to fly Apollo 11, but still not knowing if that one was going to be the one to set foot on the moon.
All right, many people will remember that day. Most of us, if not all of us, have seen the archive footage and have heard the words I've just played a few moments ago. Is it urban legend or is it true that he actually intended to say it's one small step for a man as opposed to one small step for man?
That's what he says. The legend was that he also only thought of it while up there. It wasn't something that he had determined on the way to the moon, what will be my immortal words? I'm going to be given the opportunity to set foot first. What am I going to say? It kind of rolled off the tongue the way we all hear and know it. But you are right. Legend has it that it was going to be one small step for a man, as in himself, but this was going to be one giant leap for mankind.
Well, it was pretty well inspired. If it was a spur-of-the-moment utterance, it's gone down in history and couldn't really be more perfect.
That's true. And even one thing to tell you about, while there was a massive audience at the time that watched the landing live, it was only a population back then in 1969 on the 20th of July of 600 million people worldwide. But back then, that was 1/5 of the world's population. So it was still, and it holds the record as the largest audience ever to have witnessed a live event ever.
What happened to Neil Armstrong and indeed Aldrin and the Collins, the crew, after the Apollo mission?
Well, for the 2.5 years that they, subsequently after coming safely back to Earth, they did have their obligations, essentially under contract with NASA, to be able to promote it, do ticker tape parades, one of the missions missions is a loose term, but one of their obligations was to visit dignitaries in other countries, whereupon 135 pieces of moon rock were presented to 135 nations, mostly by Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins. Collins himself, Michael Collins, who was the command pilot of the Columbia orbiter during the mission, is actually of Irish-American descent, so there's an Irish connection there all this time. But after that, Armstrong himself kind of shied away from the limelight. He didn't like it. He had a mission to do. He went up and did it, and that was his job. He got paid for it. Aldrin, on the other hand, he liked the limelight, didn't take to it very well, though. He had a history of suffering with alcoholism, substance abuse, went through 3 marriages, but in the last decade or so he has written books about it, and there are some very good stories that if you read any of his books that he's written, particularly his autobiography, Magnificent Desolation. But for Armstrong, he shied away. He didn't like the limelight. It was very rare to actually get an interview with him.
Well, it has been suggested, and you'll know more about this, that I'm not sure, was it Armstrong or Aldrin, one of them had almost a spiritual experience. They were quite affected by being on the moon and looking back at Earth.
I'd say all of them had spiritual experiences. They interpret it themselves, or they portray it in different ways. There is a significance, this pale blue dot. You're looking at your home from nearly 300,000 kilometres away and hoping you're going to get back after a couple hours of an excursion on the surface. But they all did feel this wondrous sense of awe. This planet is here for everyone. It's not meant to be owned by any particular nation. It's supposed to be governed in peace. Things like this. They did have their own spiritual beliefs. I suppose they were accentuated by being up there in the vastness of space, looking down upon it on that fateful day.
I suppose they had the most amazing sense of perspective that any human being can ever get.
Can you imagine yourself if you were up there looking down, just how much awe you would be?
It's
you
impossible
would be
to
speechless.
fathom.
It would be impossible to fathom. Now, these guys had a job, they were pros, and they did it. But, yeah, they would have had this amazing sense of, I've accomplished this massive achievement. Mankind struggles to get this far. No one has done it since. But, yeah, it just seems like such a small achievement all the same.
How do you think Neil Armstrong should be remembered globally? Because he was an American, and there's even discussion of a state funeral for him in the US. But because of what he achieved for mankind, is there an onus on all of us, all nations, to do something?
I think so. I mean, it is one of his beliefs. The moon is there for the taking. It's not owned by any one person. But this objective of, if you aim for the stars, you will reach the moon. We did that in 1969. I'd say Armstrong's legacy, if he had to leave one behind, is, aim for the heavens. Humans love discovery. We love going and exploring and discovering something new. There's ways of benefiting mankind through all of these ventures. And I think that if he had to say, this is one thing I want you to do in my legacy, is continue to explore in peace. Discover what is out there. Get out there and spread your wings.
And on that note, Seanie Morris of the Midlands Astronomy Club, thank you very much for taking our call today.
Thank you very much, Will.